right. Well, I am Carrie, and I'm on the Andersons events team. And I just want to take a second to welcome all of you to our event with Melanie Benjamin tonight. And thank you all for being here, of course. The Andersons family has been selling books independently in the Chicagoland area since 1875, believe it or not. So we have been through some stuff, but nothing has ever been quite like this COVID landscape that we find ourselves in. So we just wanted to let you know that we deeply appreciate your support of Andersons, both through attending this event tonight and through purchasing the book, maybe through us. We just are very grateful for your business during this incredibly hard time, and that you continue to show up for our events program, which I know is not quite the same in this virtual format. A couple things about tonight before we get going. As mentioned previously, your cameras and microphones will stay off, so please keep them off. If you would like to ask questions, we will have a Q&A session. So Melanie and Christina will be talking for a little while, and then we'll go ahead and take questions at the end. So what I ask is that you go ahead and just submit those through, hold on, I got some more in the waiting room, through the chat function here on Zoom, and I will be monitoring that throughout the event. And then we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So just keep submitting them through there. I will tell you guys, I don't know how many of these virtual events you guys have attended versus the fact that we've put on, this is probably like my 100th one at this point. And the best events really are the ones where people submit as many questions as they can come up with, because that just makes it more interactive for everybody and for the authors. And it just makes it a lot more fun. And it just feels a little more intimate that way. So if you guys could just go ahead and get those in, that'd be great. One more thing, if you ordered a book for tonight, please give us about 24 hours. So maybe like Friday morning-ish, if you're gonna come pick it up at the store in Naperville. If you ordered it to be shipped, we'll most likely start shipping them out tomorrow. And I think we should be able to get through them all tomorrow. If you've not ordered your book for tonight or would like another signed copy, they do make great gifts. I will be putting info on how to order more copies in the chat, and like with a link to order. So, okay, enough from me. We are here tonight, of course, with Melanie Benjamin and Christina Baker Kline. Melanie Benjamin is the New York Times bestselling author of The Aviator's Wife, among many other beloved bestselling titles. Benjamin used to live in Chicago and no longer does. I'll let her tell you about that. And she's now hard at work on her next historical novel, which I'm hoping that we get a little peek at tonight too. Her newest book we are celebrating tonight, The Children's Blizzard, was chosen as an Anderson's Bookshop's featured pre-order and is a recommended book club pick for winter of 2021.
Well, I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yes, it is. Oh, yes. No, well, because I loved this book, but I could go on all night. She is in conversation tonight with Christina Baker Kline, who is the award-winning and New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels and has been published in 40 countries. Her essays, articles, and reviews have appeared in publications nationally as well. And her latest book, The Exiles, which came out late last summer, early fall of 2020, was chosen as an Anderson's Best of 2020 title and is also one of our recommended book club winter picks for 2021. Okay, and with that, I'm gonna disapparate here into the ethers, and then I will be back on for the Q&A. Thanks for being here, ladies.
Fantastic. I'm so happy to be here. I'm Christina. I'm here to bow at the feet of the wonderful Melanie Benjamin. This novel, if you have not read it, The Children's Blizzard, is so compelling and captivating. And I can't wait to learn more. I read it, and my name is on the back of the book, but which I'm so thrilled about. But I can't wait to hear about the backstory of this book. But I just wanted to say hello, Melanie.
Hey, Christina.
I'm so glad to see you. We've become good virtual friends, I would say. Yeah. And today, Melanie, yesterday sent me the most gorgeous bouquet of flowers, which I posted all over the internet. But you didn't need to send anything because reading the book was such a pleasure. So Melanie, let's start by, I want to ask you, because I think some of the people in this room may not have read it yet. What is this novel, The Children's Blizzard, about?
Well, first of all, thank you, Christina, for your beautiful words of endorsement on the back of the book and all your support. And you're so funny because you're like my Zoom buddy. Like if I send you an email and you go, well, let's just Zoom. You're the only person I know who like really wants to Zoom, because everyone else is like, I've had enough Zooms lately.
I know. It's just fast and easy.
Cute though. So yeah, quickly, I'll tell you about what the book is about for those who don't know. On January 12th, 1888, which was 133 years ago yesterday, a deadly blizzard hit the Great Plains on the afternoon. The day had dawned surprisingly warm, and on the afternoon of that day, this blizzard swept the Great Plains right when school was letting out. And this actual blizzard is known to history as the children's blizzard, because so many of the victims were children, the school children, but also their teachers, 15 young girls, 16, 17 years old, just out of the schoolroom themselves, who suddenly had to make life or death decisions in an instant. They had to decide whether or not to let their pupils go and make a run for it and try to outrun the storm, or keep them inside and risk freezing to death, or maybe even starving to death in these really inadequately insulated one-room schoolhouses. So I've kind of been fascinated about this event. I knew a little bit about it when I was thinking this might be something to write about. I did a little bit more research, and I discovered that this is an immigrant story, because when you're talking about the homesteading years after the Homestead Act had passed on the Great Plains, after what was known as the Indian Wars were over, this is a story of immigrants migrating from Northern European to come over here to settle this land. It is a story of school teachers having to make life and death decisions in the classroom like we are seeing today. It's certainly a story of the tragedy of the Native Americans whose land it had been. And I think their tragedy kind of hangs over the novel, rather like a cloud, even after the blizzard is gone. And it's a story of disinformation to further an agenda. Yeah. Because, as I found out, and this was very interesting, so many of the immigrants, they came over on a false promise, because there was a propaganda campaign to write articles that described the Great Plains as a gentle, bountiful land where the weather was mild all the time and you could grow anything. And these false disinformation were planted and passed off as actual news stories in newspapers in places like Norway and Sweden and Germany to get them over. But at its heart, the Children's Blizzard is a story of two teachers who are sisters, who each make different decisions when the blizzard strikes. And in that terrifying moment, the decision each of them make will completely alter and impact their lives and the lives of their pupils, and how that will follow them the rest of their lives. A little bit about the Children's Blizzard.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's a great description. You know, one of the things I was struck by as I read this book, because it's something that I wrestled with in my own novel, The Exiles, my new novel, which is about Australian convict women.
And it's wonderful, and I loved it. Please read The Exiles.
Well, I'm not here to talk about my book, but I did need to set up my question by asking you, by saying that as I wrote that book, part of what I really had to do, a particular challenge of the subject matter, was just telling the truth about what happened, but not writing a grim, overwhelmingly upsetting or depressing story. And I thought of that as I read The Children's Blizzard, because it was life or death for these people. How did you do that, Melanie? How did you balance the heartbreak?
Right. There's no getting around it. There's a tragedy that happens. This is a tragic novel in many ways. But I look at it as a cathartic read, because it's not just tragedy. You're going to experience every emotion while you're reading this book. Yes, you're going to cry probably, but you're also going to have hope and love and witness courage and good deeds and people making amends and forgiving each other in the aftermath of this blizzard. So I really did try to concentrate on all those emotions, right? And I really found myself embracing the idea of making something beautiful out of a tragedy. And I hope that I did that with the blizzard, and with the novel, because it is hard. One way I think maybe I avoided this is that I follow so the first half of the book is really a thriller. It reads kind of like someone described it as Stephen King meets Little House on the Prairie, and I think this is a very good description of the book, because that first half of the book, the blizzard is stalking everyone, right? They're out in it. It's a survival story, and the blizzard is like this major character, and you just don't know who's going to live and who's going to die. Then the second half then follows the aftermath. And I think that's how I may have tried to not make it all completely like we end when all the bad things happen. We see what happens to the survivors. And some of it's interesting and some of it's fortuitous and some of it's not. Again, you're feeling all the feels, but we do kind of follow them through in the aftermath of the blizzard, to the point where many of them get to, kind of take stock of it and make amends with each other. And some characters find themselves somewhat redeemed by their acts.
Well, it's such a satisfying novel that way, because you really do find out what happens to people. You don't just leave us with the end of the blizzard. We get to see how their lives unfold a little bit. And that is
they're ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, but
Yeah.
yet those decisions that they have to make in a snap will certainly alter their lives forever. And I always want to know what happened next. I was talking to someone the other day, and I love the movie Titanic. It's like, I wanted a movie about what happened to Rose after she got back to the United States and everything, because you get a little glimpse of it and a little montage of photographs of her. But I wanted to have that movie. And I think that was in my mind when I was writing this book and deciding to go further past the blizzard timeline.
Yeah, that I can see that. And I was thinking, it's interesting that you mentioned the Little House books, because I've always talked about those books being my favorite childhood books, and they were sort of transformative for me. And I wrote a novel about a rural woman called A Piece of the World that was very much drew on my memories of that. And even my novel Orphan Train has pieces
definitely
of that Midwestern experience. Did you love those books as a child? And did you feel at all influenced as you had this subject matter that you were taking?
I think if you are a woman of our generation, as a little girl, you definitely cut your teeth on the Little House on the Prairie books, right? They're just as important and seminal as Little Women, I think, for those of us of this age. And I certainly loved those books as a child and devoured them. And, that is more my family background. My grandparents, my mother's side of the family, both her parents, their great grandparents came over from Germany in the 1870s, and they farmed in Illinois, not Nebraska or Dakota, but still that is part of my heritage, right? Part of my DNA. So that was another intriguing reason. So I think, but now as an adult, I realize that the Little House on the Prairie books are problematic, that they're not the real story. There were Black people on the plains settling. And in fact, I have a character in my book, a Black bartender in Omaha, and we see his story and how his experience is different, because in the Little House on the Prairie books, it's a story of a white American-born family. And it really does ignore the tragedy of the Native Americans, and it depicts them in a very problematic light. Same thing with Black Americans and even immigrants. If you think back to those books, the few immigrants that they mention in those books are always kind of treated not quite well. I mean, they're usually depicted as a little more poor and a little less clean than the Ingalls family is. And so as much as I love those books, and yes, I think I kind of wanted to write the realistic, grittier, grown-up version of Little House on the Prairie, because I think that's necessary. I don't want to take anything away from the enjoyment that those books gave me as a child and their influence, and I have reread them to this day. But I wanted to make amends, I think, for some of the things that I felt that those books got wrong or left out, written in a different time, and it's just part of the general whitewashing of history that we're dealing with today. And so my book, and in some ways, is a reaction to those novels.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not just a whitewashing of history. I think it's that, that the author, Lauren Ingalls Wilder, had this childhood that was very specific, and she experienced it in a certain way, and that's what we get in those books. Whereas
she's not even telling the truth, though. Her life, the life that the Ingalls experienced, was much, much darker.
Oh, sure. I know. I've read the biography and all of that.
And
and she was writing for children, which is also.
She was writing for children. I have not yet seen the American Masters, or is it American Experience documentary about her that just came out. But I read the biography Prairie Fires that much of it is based on. And so, even she is writing for children, yes, but she's not even telling the truth about her own experience.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as a novelist, it felt like, and especially a novelist writing in 2021, you in 2020, publishing in 2020, you really were able to sort of look at this kaleidoscopic picture. You've got so many people from different backgrounds, as you say. So one question I have is, what led you to this story? How did you, why was it this story that you chose to write a novel about?
Finding the story that I want to tell is the thing that is becoming a little bit, harder with every book. I don't know if do you experience it that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard because you know how much work it is and how much time it is, and
how long you're going to keep talking about it once it's done.
Yeah.
And there are just so many other things, other people kind of peering over your shoulder as you're making this decision, and a lot of other considerations to take into account. So I have found that it is, I have to think harder and longer and be much more cautious about what I write about. And so I was just at one of those places where I felt that the kind of historical fiction I had been writing, which was primarily writing about real people's lives, primarily women, but in the case of Swans of Fifth Avenue, also Truman Capote, Bill Paley. And that was interesting and fulfilling for quite a long time. And I loved doing it. But I was ready for a change because I don't ever want to go stale. I don't ever want to write the same book twice. And I just was ready to go in a different direction. But I know me, and I don't think I wouldn't be happy at this point in my life not writing historical fiction. I just constantly still finding such incredible stories about the past. So I just thought I would maybe switch it a little bit. And instead of writing about a real person, find a real event that I could construct a novel around and imagine the characters. And I knew it had to be a big event, right? It had to have something that was just a hugely dramatic thing that happened, that gave me a very large canvas to work with, and that I could come to from many different angles. And that's how I kind of came to the idea of the Children's Blizzard. I had been talking to my editor at the time, and she was saying, well, maybe you've not really written about children not since Alice I Have Been. She said, maybe something that has children involved. And I immediately just blurted out the Children's Blizzard, because I knew the name. I knew some of it. I knew it was a tragedy on the plains. She'd never heard of it. So I went to do a little bit more research. And that's when I started to see all the different stories that all the different issues and themes that I could explore, plus really push myself as a writer to write this nature book, right? To describe this blizzard and the snow and the cold and the wind in a million different ways from a million different perspectives. I knew it was going to be a lot of fun.
But also a huge challenge.
It is a challenge, but a fun challenge. I had a lot of fun writing this book, which sounds horrible because yes, people died. And it's, I shouldn't have fun writing a sad book. I still had a lot of fun writing this book just because of that very, very reason, to be able to really, I'd never written anything like that first half of this book before. And I loved the challenge of it. I really did.
Well, Melanie, as you say, the blizzard is a character in the book. And you writing about weather in this very detailed way that is dramatic and is, always interesting. How did you do that? Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I would love to say I went out in the middle of a snowstorm and walked around without clothes on, just to figure out to experience, or without coats on, to experience it. In fact, at one point I asked my son to do just that. He lived in Denver and a blizzard hit. And I was like, if you love your mother, go take a walk in a blizzard without your coat on and report back. So I'd love to say that's true, but it's not true. The basis of all this, there is a collection of oral histories from many of the survivors and witnesses of the storm, and even relatives of those who perished, called In All Its Fury. And it was kind of self-published back in the 1930s. That was a wonderful source because it was the eyewitness memory. These people witnessed the storm. So from that, I was able to get an idea of what that storm cloud looked when it came. And they all said it was full of electricity, that there were just like little tumbleweeds of electricity in front of it, and stoves started throwing off, blue sparks. And so that certainly helped me understand that part. Even the descriptions of the snow were very interesting, that it wasn't like a fluffy snow or even a wet snow. It was an odd, gritty, sand-like snow that clogged people's noses and eyes. And that was a wonderful detail for me to have. So that was certainly a great resource. And then from there, I had all these sets of people out on their different journeys. I'd set that all in motion when the storm hit. So I then had to describe the storm at different times during the storm from different perspectives of people in different places, with their own things going on in their head. It was just a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it, but my brilliant editor, and I both went through the book though when it was over, making sure I hadn't used too many repetitive phrases. That was something we were trying to keep an eye on, because it's very easy to do that. But
find option is very useful.
Yes. But it's the imagination, it's the imagination, the ability for good or for bad. And if you're a novelist, it's for good. If in real life, it's not so good, to constantly imagine the most dire of circumstances every minute of your day, which is my life.
Exactly. Which is lovely. Well, one of the things, when I read the book, I'm pretty sure I read it in manuscript before it had a cover, as I remember it.
Yeah.
And the cover is, when I saw it, I thought, I can't imagine a better cover for this book. How did this happen? Were you part of this decision?
No, this is the easiest cover conversation I've ever had. For people who don't know in publishing, rarely does an author get full cover approval. I don't have that, and I don't. Maybe you do, but I don't. But we are always asked our opinions and our input, which is, I love. It is a collaboration at some point. But so in the past, I'd be given cover, mock-ups, and most of the time, there'd be a little discussion, right? They sent me this, and I think the only thing I said was, maybe let's make the font a different color, because it was a different color. That's the only thing. They sent me this. I said, it's perfection. I have nothing to say. And I think it might be the first time I ever had nothing to say about a cover. It's
definitely.
I don't know. It's just the brilliant art department at Penguin Random House, who, and Robin Schiff, I think, is the person who usually is in charge. And it's haunting, and it's compelling. And I just said, yes, please.
It works. So Melanie, which character arcs did you most enjoy creating? How did you develop those characters? Yeah,
and so there are about 6 points of view in the novel. So we're following 3 or 4 major characters, and then a couple of 2, little bit minor characters from their point of view. And even at one point we follow. I just had a great discussion with Kate Quinn about the perspective of a hawk. At one point, where you're at the head of a hawk flying high above the prairie. I kind of went there.
I love that. I love that.
But mainly I stuck to people, not animals. There are some animals, but so I knew 3 of the characters, the 2 school teachers, who in my novel are sisters, but in real life they really weren't, and the young girl Annette, who represents a really dark side of the homesteading years. It wasn't all Little House on the Prairie and clean little, even clean little soddies. There were a lot of very desperate people who came over and found themselves just mired and, unable to speak the language, and just abject poverty. And Annette was also based on an actual real person who was impacted by the storm. Her mother sells her to this family for the price of a pig, basically. And so those 3 characters were somewhat based, some parts of their story were based on some of the actual survivors. And I knew their arcs almost from the beginning. I knew what their arcs would be. And I loved them, but they didn't surprise me. But 2 characters completely surprised me. And one was Gavin Woodson, who is a completely fictitious character, a failed newspaper man who writes these stories, propaganda, the lies, paid for by the railroad boosters. and the territory, the state boosters who needed this land to fill up with white bodies for a lot of reasons, because railroads needed to make money, moving goods and services and people, and these territories needed to become state. And one thing I just realized is I'm going on a tangent, that the Homestead Act, which kind of started this great migration of immigrants and people from the East settling, the land that formerly was that was the Native Americans, it prohibited anyone who had fought in the Confederacy. So they could still buy land, but they weren't getting the deal that the Homestead Act offered, which was 160 acres for the price of a filing fee, and you had to live on it for 5 consecutive years. And at the end of that time, you would get the land. And people who had fought, and this all had just so recently happened, anyone who'd fought against the Union couldn't do it. So that's why they kind of had to go to Europe to try to get these bodies over here. So Gavin represents that person who is kind of a dissipated, jaded, self-loathing journalist who has little respect for himself and for the people, the rubes, as he calls them, these immigrants who he lured over. And his entire arc, I knew I wanted him in the book, but I really didn't understand the role he was going to play until that very first chapter, and I'm writing them, and all of a sudden he starts to take a walk in a different direction than I thought he was going to take, and that walk in a different direction leads to an encounter I hadn't planned, and that changes his entire trajectory, and it opens his eyes, and part of his, it's a very redemptive arc. He, in the aftermath of the storm, and this is based on truth, there were stories written that kind of elevated some of these young school teachers into heroines, into media stars, and kind of changed their lives. And in his doing that, and again, this actually happened, that really opens his heart, opens his eyes, gives him an entire redemptive arc that I hadn't planned. And then the other character was Anna Pedersen, who starts out, she's the woman that one of the school teachers is boarding with in her household. And it's a very, I don't know, what do you want to say, very claustrophobic household. There's the husband is misbehaving and perhaps taking liberties with the young school teacher against her wishes. And the mother's very jealous. And she's also the one in charge of little Annette. And she starts out, she's very distasteful. I guess there's no other way to say it. Her arc surprised me. And she just, it's a dark twist, but it's in its own way kind of a redemptive, soul-saving twist, but it's in a really dark place. And I had never written a character like Anna Pedersen before, and I loved that arc. I can't say I related to it, but I can say it was the one that surprised me the most, and I think the one I ended up liking the most. Well, not because it's likable, just because it was so different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I completely understand that. And when you're sort of challenging yourself in a way that you've never done before, and when you're entering territory that's new, you can have all of these amazing surprises as you go. This is the darkest novel you've written.
It is, yeah. And even more than the Nazis, which is like hard to top.
Yeah. I mean, in that it is, you really are dealing with life and death at every moment, and you're dealing with children. So that combination is very precarious.
It is. It is, and it's hard to write.
Did you feel, what was it terrifying and did it inspire you then as you're thinking of as you move ahead? Mm-hmm. I think, and I want to ask you also about what you said about how you really love writing historical fiction and that's where you want to stay. But as you move ahead with your next novel, I don't know if you are ready to talk about that at all, but did this influence you and change anything about the way you write or the way you work or the way you think of your own subject matter?
It's interesting. In some ways, this was one of 2 books that I've written, the other one being The Swans of Fifth Avenue, that were the easiest books I've ever written. In that the whole book came to me, and the way it appears in the novel is pretty much the way, almost pretty much the way I put it on the page at the very beginning. Of course, there's editing and revision and all that thing, because darn, I'm not brilliant yet. But but in the way that it felt like it was a gift from the gods, and that it was just this fully, I mean, it took me a while to get the fully realized story in my head, but once it was there, it just, the writing flowed very easily. Same thing happened with Swans of Fifth Avenue. And I have to say both of those books required the least amount of editing I've ever had on a novel. The others were much more different, varying degrees of making me cry on a daily basis in the editing process. So on the one hand, it was delightfully easy. On the other hand, it is a novel, like I said, with a lot of different characters whose stories and experiences are all, they tap all the emotions. Again, it's a very cathartic read, I think, in that way, if you really want to feel cleansed afterwards, because you will experience them all. But it also took every emotion out of me. And especially with the writing of the children.
Yes.
That I needed to take more time before I sat down to write again. You know, I think people have heard me say this before, but I had planned on taking this year off anyway for a variety of reasons. Then the pandemic hit, and it turned out to be a good thing that I'd taken it off. So I had just where I was as a writer, and I'd published 7 books in 11 years. This is my 7th, and a couple more that I didn't publish, and I just felt like I needed a break. But after writing this one that really, again, pummeled me emotionally, but I loved it because I'm just a weirdo in that way. That very, very deeply disturbed, emotional person. I did need to have a bit of a healing space, because I do think, and I can't share what the next book is. And it took me part of this whole year was also trying to find what I want to write next, because as we talked about, I've learned it needs to be like the Children's Blizzard. It has to be, I want it to be something I can just give my whole self to. I'm not saying I dabbled in any of my other books, but I really feel I'm ready to just completely give of myself in the writing, and I want to just dive in with everything. I keep talking about the big canvas. So I think I have found it. But I think it does continue down that path of finding beauty in tragedy. Which really appealed to me in the writing of this book, and it appeals to me very much with the next one. And I think I needed to take some time before I'm ready to dive back into this kind of cesspool of emotion. So that's all I can say at this point. But I really, truly, I've got this one in my head now. I've got the characters. I know the story. I've got a synopsis there. It's all there. So when I sit down to write, which will be I've already started a little bit after this is all done with the pub for the Children's Blizzard, I think I'm ready to just dive back into the abyss again.
Will the next one require a lot of research also?
It is an event and a time period and a place I know pretty well.
Oh, great. That's
so
great.
Yes, certainly there's always some research, right, whenever you're doing anything, but I never start from zero. I don't know about you, but every book I've written, even though they are all in different time periods and different eras, I'm always kind of starting from a pretty high base level of knowledge of something about the time and the history, the way people talked, what society expected of women, and that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't. It's some research, but it's not going to be a lot of research.
A ton. So here you are, you're on book tour with this new novel.
In my sweatpants. So different.
So what has this been like, and what do you think of this brave new world of
well, what about you? You did the same thing.
promotion?
So I was watching you a lot when the Exiles came out in August. You did a lot of events.
Yeah, I did a lot of events. I did a lot of events before my book came out with other authors, and I'm doing, a lot with other authors now. I really believe in supporting writers who are, going into the maelstrom of Zoom and Crowdcast and all the other programs that we're doing. And I do think that there are a lot of benefits to this, to having this sort of intimate conversation. I think you lose things as well. I mean, I'd love to hear how you're feeling about it.
I think one of the really wonderful things that has happened in the pandemic is the authors helping authors. It's even a hashtag now on Twitter and Instagram. And there's always been that. That's always been a part of publishing. And I've always, had author friends, but there were authors that I don't know who were talking about my book yesterday in ways that didn't happen in, to the extent that it had not happened that way in the past. There was always that. But it's like on steroids now, because I think everyone realizes it's all hands on deck right now. It's not just the fact that we can't be out there, talking about our books in person, and that bookstores can't have people really in anymore to browse, to talk to the people behind the counter at the way that they used to. And then the news cycle is sucking the oxygen out of everything these days, which is, somebody said on Twitter, it used to be, authors just, said, please buy my book. And now they're like, please let there not be a coup on the day my book comes out. I mean, that's to the point where we are right now. So this all hands on deck kind of support from authors to authors and authors is overwhelmingly positive and wonderful. And I feel so blessed that we're witnessing this right now. And you're still there, right? Okay. And so that's great. And I feel publishers are really, really, understanding the challenges and working with booksellers with these events, and working with social media in creative ways that didn't have an experience to the extent in the past. And I rarely did events with other authors on the road. When you're on the publicity tour, that doesn't, because you have to be in the same town at the same time, right?
Right.
So this is wonderful that all my events are in conversation with other wonderful, generous authors like you. So that's a lot of fun. This is a lot of good.
I think you get different questions, and you kind of, go down different rabbit holes.
Every conversation's going to be different because we all have different relationships with each other, right? So and then anyone can join in. They don't have to live in the town that we're at. So for the reader, that it's also a positive. I miss traveling though. I do miss it. I miss the airport. I miss airports. Rebecca Mackay said, I just miss going to the MAC counter at O'Hare and trying on all the makeup. And I know exactly what she means because I love that MAC store at O'Hare. And I miss that. I miss seeing people in person. I miss signing books in person. And I don't know. It's the reality we're given, and we just have to make the most of it.
How have you had interactions, or what has it been like having interactions with your readers, with the people who are in this room right now, in this virtual room?
For one thing, I'm seeing like my editor, my agent, these are people who've never been to any of my events in the past because they couldn't, they were working. And so that's wonderful to see that like I call it my Random House posse. I love seeing my Random House posse here. That is just amazing. And then I do see familiar names that I wouldn't have seen before. So it's wonderful. And I hope it's working out for everybody out there. I mean, from the end of the standpoint of the audience, that's perspective I don't have right now, but I hope it's working out. I hope they're enjoying these.
I hope so. I think that they are. Everyone is here. And you're back, Carrie. Hi.
Thanks, Carrie.
And we've got some great questions. I can tell you from the bookstore side of things, the virtual events, they're smaller. That's the one thing we're finding, although they're starting to really grow. But the feedback we get from people who attend them is that they really enjoy it. It's just a matter of getting more people, I think, to open their minds to, everyone's so tired of screens by the end of the day, like asking them to get back on a screen. I think sometimes
that's true.
It's funny because we've definitely noticed a huge retention of the people who have given it a try. Then they're like, oh, this is great. And they keep coming. So it's building. And let's see. So we have some questions. I had one question actually before I launch into everyone else's questions. Sorry to jump in front of the line, but I read this book. I think right after you and I talked when you moderated that event with Buchanan.
Kathy Buchanan. Yeah.
I went in the next day and I think I left a Post-it note like in the Andersons employee room that was like, I am looking for this arc and it is mine if it comes in. So it did. And I absolutely loved it. One of the side stories that I didn't hear you address in your guys' conversation that really interested me is that there's just this small side arc about the very beginning of what would end up becoming the National Weather Service, and kind of like the whole beginnings of modern weather forecasting. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that for a second, and also just like what kind of warning they would have even gotten back then on the planes for this.
Right. So there was no National Weather Service back then. But in the after the Civil War, after what they called the Indian Wars, and then the railroads started to build across the nation, they really realized that they needed, especially for the railroads, they needed some way to kind of what they call indicate the weather. They didn't call it forecasting, they didn't call it prediction, they called it indication. And so after the Civil War, there was a division of the Army Signal Corps that started to train, that the officers in this particular division started to train in the basics of meteorology as best they could for the times in which they lived, right? There were computer mods, there weren't satellites, there were computers. So they learned, barometric pressure readings and what that meant, and how to, what changes in atmospheric pressure and all that stuff. That's really all they had. And then they were sent out. Well, they were in the East as well, to posts. And each person would be in charge of taking a series of readings at different specific times during the day. So you're talking about as far west as, at the time, Montana, and as far east as New York, just a series of posts. And they would telegraph. So they had to be where there was a telegraph. And in those days, that was not always reliable because, again, during this, all the time with the Native Americans, oftentimes the telegraph lines would be cut or the weather would bring them down. So they would, as best they could, telegraph the readings back east to Washington, D.C. That was the only office at the time where they would then have an enormous map of the United States, and they would handwrite every reading down, and that way kind of plot a map and try to indicate what the weather would be in certain areas of the country at a certain time period. Then they would have to write that indication down and telegraph it back out to each one of these stations and to the newspapers and to the railroad stations. So obviously by the time the weather got to where it needed, particularly west of the Mississippi, it was too late. The weather had already blown through. Also, so right before the Children's Blizzard, I think the same year of the Children's Blizzard, they did open up a second branch in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this was to kind of meet the demands of the railroads. We're saying, look, we need better indications. The thing about the Great Plains is it's a very unpredictable place. These were not people used to, these were Easterners trying to live there, trying to predict the weather there. The weather in the Great Plains is very different than it is in the East. You have the Rocky Mountains being this big disruptive source. And then the Arctic fronts coming down and meeting the Gulf of Mexico. It was just, they didn't know how to do it, but they tried. So at least when they opened up the St. Paul office, it took a little bit less time to gather the information and send it out. But the problem was many of the people who were supposedly in charge of collecting the data at these different outposts often would falsify their records and pay someone, they'd make it up and pay somebody to telegraph it for them while they went off fishing. It happened a lot. So it wasn't very reliable, but once the data was gathered, then they would write indications up for several times a day for the different regions. And then they would send them back out to the posts and to the newspapers that would run them in their daily newspapers. The only way, so the homesteaders, most of them didn't speak English. And so they couldn't have read the newspapers like in Omaha that would have written them up. But even they couldn't get, there was no newspaper delivery to the homesteads in that.
I was wondering that when I was reading it.
There wasn't.
Like, how does this information get from Omaha to them?
So when it would go to the train stations, and they had flags that they would raise. And the flags would mean a certain kind of thing. And the worst flag was what they called a cold wave warning. And that's the worst weather in the winter. And it really basically it's like a blizzard warning. And so they could raise the flags, but yet again, most of the homesteaders did not live within view of these flags. And so they did get the forecast wrong. They didn't predict the blizzard. But it's a matter of, would it have mattered if they had. Now, so shortly after that blizzard, 2 months later, another blizzard hit the East Coast. That's called the Great Blizzard of 1888. And there was actually a documentary about it, and resulted in a large loss of life. And that was kind of the last straw. And they took the weather indicating away from the Army Signal Corps. And then they kind of started to, because there was a lot of corruption. And then that was then the beginning. It went under the Department of the Treasury, I believe it is now, or yeah, I think the National Weather Service might be. That was the beginning of what we now know as the National Weather Service. So there you go, more than you wanted to know.
I found that so interesting. Like when I know the three of us have lived in cold weather climates, so we can totally relate to that feeling of like you wake up and it's 50 degrees and you think, oh my gosh, it's so great. And then
right, let's go.
Up, right?
But one thing I really do want people to take away from this novel is that, we live in a time now where when weather is impactful, when the hurricanes come that nobody could really forecast to be as hard as they are, it's a shock, it's a surprise, it's a failure, right? Because we get text messages when there's a blizzard warning now, or a tornado warning. And to an extent, I think we take weather for granted. We don't live with it, and it doesn't impact our lives the way it impacted these people's lives. But yet ever so often, an event will come along that will make us remember, nature always wins, right?
Yeah. We cannot control nature.
Yeah.
As much as we would like to. Clearly this year has taught us that. Okay, so this is a great question from someone who didn't share their name. You talked a little bit about the process you go through when choosing the next topic, even though it's probably a little different for each book. But how do you actually go about researching the subjects and finding those, what makes your book so great for both of you, really? So this question is going to be for both of you. Are those really neat and interesting, like personal details? Like, how do you guys find those that you end up basing, some of your characters or stories on?
Christina, you could go first.
Yeah, I mean, for me, you were saying you don't do a ton of research. I kind of do. I don't think I'm quite as smart as you are, Melanie. I don't have enough in my head, but like the book I just did about Australia, I just read and talked to lots of people and befriended a couple of historians and got all their stories. And I find that those small details come out through touring sites. I went twice to Australia, and I went to these convict sites and a number of Aboriginal museums and things like that. And I stumble on details that stick out to me, and then I take a note about them and come back to them, or they stick in my brain. I do find that a novel is a series of building small details into a cohesive character and point of view and story, and that without those, you just have vague generalities. You really want to have the warp and woof of someone's life in a book. And so to me, those are the most important and the most interesting things to include. What about you, Melanie?
Well, the first time I wrote a historical novel, I did not know I was writing a historical novel. Alice, I've been, and my agent finally said, well, you wrote a historical novel. So I really didn't know what I was doing. And I thought it was okay to make a lot of stuff up. And I certainly knew you had to ground the novel in the reality of the time, and you had to have enough details that people could feel transported to another time and another place. But I think I said all of my books I have an armchair historian's smattering of knowledge about the time and the place. So what I learned, simply because I didn't know what I was doing and had no money, that first book, I couldn't travel to Oxford, England. I couldn't do it. I had no money, is to rely on my imagination more. And since then, I have learned through trial and error that when I over-research, that's when I can't write the novel. That's when the novel grows cold to me. I have to have room for my imagination to fill in the blanks. So when you're talking, I also learned the details, and people write and read historical novels for a lot of different reasons. And some people do want to have every page stuffed with every single period detail of the clothing and what they ate and what, the names of the horses. I don't write for that reason. I'm much more concentrating on telling the story and creating interesting characters. So there are details in my novels, but I don't think my books are overstuffed with detail. They don't seem that way to me. So my research is just surprisingly, it always seems to me it shouldn't take that long. I mean, that it should take longer than it does. Like maybe a month's research generally is all I do. And I read whatever books that are available about the subject. And some of them, there are a lot of books, and some of them, there aren't very many. And if it makes sense, now I can afford to travel for research. I didn't actually go to Nebraska for this one because I was pretty well acquainted with Nebraska. If you live in Chicago and you have to drive to Denver, which I did because my son lived there at the time, you're basically seeing all the Nebraska you need to see on that drive. Plus, I know Omaha, I've been there several times, so I knew the area. And even so, as you find out too, when you go to these places, even if it's the actual place that you're writing about, but if you're writing about it 130 years ago, it doesn't look now like it did 130 years ago. Even the geography of Nebraska, there were no trees there then. The trees that we see there were planted by these people I'm writing about in this novel. So you always have to kind of be erasing what you're seeing, to make it right. So I read the books. If it makes sense, sometimes I've watched movies. I did watch Dr. Zhivago a few times for this one because even though it's a Russian story, there's a lot of snow in that movie, and it kind of gave me some inspiration to write this. So I don't do a playlist. I don't do music. I don't know. I also know the story that I want to tell, so I limit my research to that story and what those people need to know at that time. And of course, certainly there's background that I want to build their backstory up with, and they have to authentically represent, the people in that time, and their backstories have to be real at least in my mind. But still, I kind of know to limit the research. I've talked to people who've spent 2 years researching a historical novel, and God bless them. Oh man, I couldn't do that. I need to write it, and I need to have my imagination fill in the blanks.
That's so interesting that you both have such different processes there. And then I don't know how many people here tonight were with us on, what was that, Monday night? We had Jennifer Robson. And she's one of those who she will sit there for just years, like researching. And it's just so fascinating how you all have like such different processes you go through, but then like the end results are so phenomenal. And like I said, I think what I love, especially about both of your books, is that, and what I love about historical fiction, because I'm a big historical fiction fan, is that, a lot of times you can go after you're done reading and you can Google a lot of the stuff and you can find out little details here or there, but there's still so many details that you two manage to pack in that you don't find, that like I don't seem to have access to, is what I'm saying, like as I'm doing my armchair research, right, as you said. So anyways, that's just really neat that we can have such great products come out of such different processes. Just really cool. Okay, so we have a question from Tina here, and I love this question. She says, do you hide any secrets in your books that only a few people will find? And I think this would work for both of you, actually.
I think I forgot to do it in this book, but in my previous novels, they all referenced one of the people in a previous novel of mine. There was always some point where I was able to slip in a reference to another book of mine, of the people in the other books of mine. So it's like in Mrs. Tom Thumb, they're reading Alice in Wonderland in one scene, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing I did. There were little Easter eggs that I did that, but I actually think I forgot to do that this time.
I didn't catch any in this one. Yeah, that's why
I don't think I did.
Yeah.
I think I was so concentrated in a different direction, I forgot to do that. I did have the names of my grandparents' names are in this novel. And one of my great uncle's names, because like I said, my family did come from Germany too. And so there is that little secret that some of the characters in the novel are named after my family.
Oh, that's neat. How about you, Christina?
Gosh, I have done the same thing of referring to other novels in novels, not this time, but what I think maybe fits the bill in a different way is that some readers really like the sort of thread weaving that an author does through various stories, so that there are things that show up in one place, then another, then another, then another, and they notice all of that stuff and sort of see the way things, and some people don't see that at all.
Yeah.
And in this novel, there were a number of things like that that were sort of threaded through, and that you would see echoes of, like the Tempest, for example, would come in and out in different ways. And I didn't always say that it was the Tempest. And you know, a number of readers have pointed out that there's this whole building story about that. So I do love doing that, and knowing that some people will, you know, really like it and some people won't notice it at all. And in fact, in my novel Orphan Train, I started in the prologue, I basically tell the whole story of the book. And some people have said, I can't believe you gave away the whole story in the prologue. And other people have said, I can't believe I didn't realize that the two stories had anything to do with each other until page 284, you know, so people read in different ways and for different reasons. Okay. And some people really like those kinds of details.
Thank you both. Okay, so we are probably down to our last question here, and I'm going to sort of combine a few because they're kind of along the same lines, which is, so what do you enjoy reading? What are you reading now? What are you most excited about that's coming out maybe in the next few months? Because I know, you know, we all get a chance when you work in publishing, you get a chance to read things far in advance. So what are you guys excited about? What are you reading now? What do you use to escape? Lots of stuff.
I read a lot of British novels for my comfort reading, and this year, I don't know, I read Angela Thurkel and D.L. Stevenson, they were two British female novelists back in the 1930s writing in Great Britain, and they write books set in just little village towns, and there's an awful lot of stuff about, oh my, will the vicar find love kind of stuff. But I just find them charming and comforting, even when World War II intrudes, which they do, nothing bad still happens. So I've been reading a lot of those lately. I read Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, and I love Maggie O'Farrell. I've been a huge fan of hers for years, and Hamnet seems to be the book that everybody read of hers, and it was just wonderful. There you go.
It is. Yeah, I haven't read that one.
You're reading it now.
Oh,
everybody seems to love it. Yeah,
I love it. It's so good. I read Richard Powers. I know everyone was talking about the Ogre Story this year, but I didn't read that. I read a previous book of his called The Time of Our Singing. It was so good and powerful, and loved it. And I can't wait for Paula McLean's new book. I've got that here.
I have it too.
I'll have to read it, but I have it. There, I got it. When the Stars Go Dark. I can't wait to read that. It's coming out in like 3 months. What about you, Christina? What do you got?
So I am reading Hamnet right now, and I'm also reading Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which I know, which is sort of game-changing, I think, in a lot of ways. Really fascinating.
That was an Anderson's favorite of Becky Anderson, actually, this in 2020. Yeah.
It's such a great book, and it really does sort of reframe the whole conversation of race and class and culture in America. So this book is coming out March 2nd. It's called What's Mine and Yours, and it's by Naima Koster. She was a star student of mine in a master's degree program at Fordham, and she's brilliant. I think this is her breakout book. She had a really amazing novel that was a finalist for, I think, the Kirkus Prize, her debut novel called Halsey Street. But What's Mine and Yours is, this is Naima. She's the most beautiful, fabulous woman. Wow. And it's again about race and class and culture. It takes place in Durham, North Carolina, and it is really, really wonderful. And a lot of good early pre-pub stuff has happened to it. So I think it's on the verge of being a tremendously splashy and wonderful success. So I was just going to mention that. Yeah.
Renee Rosen has a novel coming out this spring too, The Social Graces. And Renee's a friend, Chicago writer, lovely, lovely person, and a lovely writer. I'm looking forward to that one too.
It's on our radar as well. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for us here tonight, ladies. Thank you so much for your time and for that wonderful conversation. It's always so interesting. Thank you, of course, also to everybody again for being here. I know I thank you guys a million times. the attendees, but you really are keeping us going right now. And I miss you all so much in person. But I see so many names that I recognize here, but we're just so grateful again for your continued business. And I just want to say good night to everybody. And also please stay well out there. We're almost there. Hopefully. Well, maybe not almost, but maybe like halfway there.
We hope soon.
Yes.
Yeah, and thank you, Carrie, thank you, Christina. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for doing this and for your support for the book and for your friendship. And it's just been so impactful and special. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And bye, Carrie. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
I know it was so great. I wish we could be in person, but it was hopefully next time. Bye guys. Thanks.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye.